Hey kids, this is Chef Jack. I want to thank you for joining me here for the next chapter in our History of Comic Book series. We do appreciate it. As has already been explained in several of the other videos, we're doing a Jack Kirby month in celebration of the fact that August 28th would have been his 100th birthday. With that in mind, it was pretty obvious that we just had to shine a spotlight on Jack the King Kirby, who was one of the most innovative, prolific, and influential creators in the history of the art form. In no small part, the history of comics is the history of Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby was born Jacob Kurtzberg on August 28, 1917, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Austria, as were most of his neighbors. He was a poor street kid who regularly got into fights with his contemporaries. Kirby apparently hated the neighborhood he grew up in and wanted to escape it as quickly as he could. He liked to draw, having taught himself how to by tracing characters from various comic strips and editorial cartoons, and he saw his artwork as a way out of the dreary life his father lived as a worker in a garment factory. He took his inspiration as an artist, and often cited as his primary influences, the artwork of comic strips and political cartoons he saw in the New York newspapers. His particular favorites were the works of Milton Caniff, Hal Foster, and Alex Raymond. At the age of 14, Kirby enrolled at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, but he left after only 1 week. He would later say, "I wasn't the kind of student that Pratt was looking for. They wanted people who could work on something forever, and I didn't want to work on any single thing forever. I wanted to get things done." His first job as an artist came in 1936 when he was hired by the Lincoln Newspaper Syndicate to create comic strips and single-panel advice cartoons that bore helpful titles like "Your Health Comes First." He did all this under the name Jack Curtis. He used a pseudonym because he was advised by fellow cartoonists that this was a way to avoid exclusive contracts. He would write for one company as one person, for another company as another person, and so on. Kirby would later take great offense to the suggestion that he used all these pseudonyms to hide his Jewishness. He remained at Lincoln until 1939, at which point he was hired by the Fleischer Animation Studios as an in-betweener on their Popeye cartoons. An in-betweener is an artist who fills in the action between the major movement frames. But working as an animator turned out not to be to Kirby's taste. He would later say, "I had to get out of there in a hurry because I couldn't take it. It was a factory. In a sense, it was like my father's factory. They were manufacturing pictures." While he was still working at Lincoln, and during his period at Fleischer, Jack Kirby entered the world of comic books when he was hired by Will Eisner and Jerry Iger's company, the Syndicated Features Corporation. There he worked on a number of weekly comic strips. Under the pseudonym Kurt Davis, Kirby created the Diary of Dr Hayward, a science fiction serial. He also drew an adaptation of The Count of Monte Cristo under his previous pseudonym Jack Curtis. And his first Western comic, Wilton of the West, was produced under the name Fred Sand. He first used the surname Kirby on 2 Lone Rider stories in Famous Funnies number 63 and 64 in October and November of 1939, where he was writing and drawing as Lance Kirby. He finally settled down on Jack Kirby as a permanent pseudonym around 1940 because, he said, it sort of reminded him of James Cagney, of whom he was an enormous fan. Kirby finally got into the superhero business when he went to work for Victor Fox at Fox Features Syndicate, doing artwork for Fox's most popular character, the Blue Beetle, a character that would later be published by first Quality Comics and then by DC. Kirby was jammed into the corner of a small, cramped room where his drawing table sat next to the one used by Bill Everett, the man who would later go on to create Namor the Submariner. Another staff creator at Fox Features Syndicate was Joe Simon, a writer/artist who occasionally moonlit as the company's editor, mostly because Victor Fox was too cheap to hire an actual editor. Simon and Kirby became close friends, and they developed a constant working relationship to the point that when Simon would move from one publishing company to another, Kirby would often follow him. In 1988, Joe Simon would recall, "I loved Jack's work, and the first time I saw it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He asked if we could do some freelance work together, and I was just delighted at the idea. we ended up working together from the second issue of Blue Bolt through about the next 25 years. It was during this time that Kirby finally moved out of his old neighborhood, but ironically he never left Brooklyn. After moving, he met a girl named Rosalind Goldstein who lived in the same apartment building as he did. The two started dating, and on her 18th birthday, he proposed to her. They were married shortly thereafter. Simon and Kirby's partnership would over time unleash a battalion of comic book stories and characters. In late 1940, Simon and Kirby were hired to work at the newly formed Timely Comics Company, about which the best could be said at that point was that they owned the rights to the Human Torch and the Submariner. Martin Goodman, publisher at Timely, decided that what they needed was more star characters, and Simon and Kirby were tasked with creating them. Many likely projects flowed forth as a result. There was Tuck the Cave Boy, Mercury, The Vision, The Red Raven, Comet Pierce, and finally, the comic for which the team would become most famous among comic book fans and the rest of the world, Captain America. Unlike their previous efforts, Captain America was an immediate success, and I do mean immediate. The first print run of Captain America #1, which was released in March of 1941, sold out in 2 days. 2 days, guys. The second issue's print run was set at over 1 million copies, and it sold out also. The demand for new Captain America material was so great that at one point Simon and Kirby worked for 36 straight hours in order to produce 10 issues, along with the bare-bones outline for a dozen more. During this time, they created most of what we think of as the Captain America mythology. They came up with Bucky and the Young Allies, the Red Skull, and most of the rest of all the background information that follows the character around. Unfortunately, this would also be the end of their relationship with Timely. Simon and Kirby felt that Martin Goodman was not paying the pair the money that they'd been promised, and so they went to National Comics Publications, which would almost immediately be renamed DC Comics. Kirby and Simon negotiated a deal which would earn them a combined $500 a week at National, compared to the combined $160 a week they were getting at Timely. While the two apparently tried to keep their upcoming shift to National a secret, according to Stan Lee, who was an editorial assistant at Timely at that time, everybody who worked there knew precisely what was going on and what was about to happen. The editors at the newly remonikered DC Comics kept the pair busy, and their rate of work, which was fantastically fast at Timely, was even more so now. Simon and Kirby often turned out 6 pages a day, and when necessary, they did more than that. They were penciling, lettering, and inking the pages, and were often scripting them too. DC at the time had a regular stable of writers, but Kirby later admitted that quite often, and here's the quote, the editors would drop off a script, and by the time the editor was downstairs again, that script had gone out the window in the shape of paper airplanes. We wrote for ourselves. During this time, Kirby's most popular characters were the Sandman and the Manhunter. While he and Simon hadn't created either character, they had drastically altered and recreated them from their original visions to the point that they bore little resemblance to their original form. But even more popular were the kid books that featured the Newsboy Legion and the Boy Commandos. The Newsboys, aided by the Guardian, a policeman who fought crime as a superhero, dwelled in the Suicide Slum, an area of an unnamed city that suspiciously resembled the neighborhood in which Kirby grew up. There, they encountered bizarre criminals and, as the war effort grew, Nazi spies as well. The boys were constantly getting into trouble and would have to rely on the Guardian to get them out of it. The Boy Commandos, however, were, if anything, even more popular than the Newsboy Legion, and eventually they were given their own title. Led by Captain Rip Carter, the Boy Commandos fought the Nazis and the Japanese much more directly than did the Newsboy Legion, because they were on the front lines after the U.S. entered the war. And naturally, when the U.S. entered the war, both Kirby and Simon were pulled away from comic books and into military service. Joe Simon went into the Navy, while Jack Kirby was drafted into the Army. He was assigned as a combat infantryman. After basic training at Camp Stewart, Georgia, he was assigned to Company F, 11th Infantry Regiment. As part of the 11th Infantry, he landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. His unit took part in regular combat operations across the European theater. He would later recall that a lieutenant, learning that the famous comic book artist Jack Kirby was under his command, would make Kirby a scout. He'd advance into towns and draw reconnaissance maps and pictures, an extremely dangerous duty. Of his time in military service, he would later say, "I didn't like Army life. I didn't like taking orders and I didn't like discipline. I really didn't like being yelled at. You'd get 10 years for punching a sergeant, so I couldn't punch a sergeant." During the winter of 1944, Kirby suffered severe frostbite on his lower extremities and was evacuated to a hospital in London, England for treatment and recovery. While there, doctors considered amputating his legs, but eventually he recovered to the point that they were saved. He was reassigned to Camp Butner in North Carolina, where he spent the last 6 months of his time in the Army in a motor pool. Kirby was honorably discharged as a private first class on July 20th, 1945, having received a Bronze Star for Valor. After his return to civilian life, Jack Kirby began working at Harvey Comics in a job that Joe Simon had arranged for him. The pair of them stayed at that company until the early 1950s, and while there they created such titles as Boy Explorers Comics, Boy's Ranch, Stuntman, and Captain 3D. The latter was based on the popular 3D movie fad of the 1950s. But what was surprising was that Kirby found his greatest success doing romance comics. He created Young Romance and he took it to Crestwood Publications, where he and Simon asked for 50% of the comic's profits. Surprisingly, Teddy Epstein and Mike Blair, Crestwood's publishers, agreed. Young Romance became Kirby's biggest hit since Captain America, and it sold out 92% of its first issue's print run. The success of this title spurred on the production of spin-off titles like Young Love, and together the titles were regularly selling out nearly 2 million copies a month. Young Romance and Young Love were swiftly joined by Young Brides and In Love, the latter featuring full-length romance stories with recurring characters. Naturally, the success of romance comics spawned dozens of imitators from publishers such as Timely and Fawcett and Quality and Fox. But despite the glut, the Simon and Kirby created romance titles continued to sell millions of copies a month, while their competitors barely scratched by. The money that Jack Kirby earned because of the success of his romance titles would allow him to finally move his family out of Manhattan, all the way out to Long Island. Kirby would work out of a private studio in the basement of his Long Island home for the next 20 years. His wife and children often jokingly called his studio the Dungeon. Unfortunately for the comic books industry, by 1954 things were changing and really not for the better. The entire industry had been undergoing massive upheavals. During this time, Kirby released some of his absolutely best material, but comic books just weren't healthy enough as a medium to support it. The Golden Age had ended, and Dr. Frederick Wortham was testifying in front of Congress. Things were beginning to look bleak. But that, however, will be the subject of our next History of Comics video. So there you go, kids. This is the first part of our look at Jack Kirby's place in comic book history. I really hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed putting it all together. I do love doing these history videos, and we are going to be doing more of them. But what did you think? Did you love this? Did you hate it? Let me know in the comments below. And please, if you liked this video, go ahead and click the little like button, and if you really liked it, share it so your friends can see it. If you want to keep up on all the rest of our videos, go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't already done so, not to mention the little notification bell. And if you want to give us a hand, we do have a Patreon and VidMe page, and they're linked below also. Feel free to hop on over to them and drop a few dollars in the bucket if you feel generous. But even if you don't, we appreciate your time. And thank you very, very much for watching.